Do you believe a father spent years trying to find out what had happened to his own son, without ever imagining that his other sons knew the truth the entire time? I know. And for a long time, it looked like they were going to get away with hiding it forever. You know those families where everyone can tell there is a favorite child, except the parents? Yeah, it looks like that is exactly what happened here. The father had several sons, but there was one of them who clearly held a different place. And the worst part is, he did not even try that hard to hide it. More attention, more affection, more trust. And then there was the kind of gesture no one even needed to explain. You know when someone receives something special and everyone immediately understands the message? It was more or less like that. The boy received a different kind of robe. Beautiful, noticeable. The kind that, even if no one said a word, seemed to say, "This one is special." Now imagine his brothers seeing that every single day. It was not just silly jealousy, it was the feeling that, inside their own house, they had already been placed second. And as if that were not enough, the boy also started talking about his dreams. But these were not ordinary dreams. They were dreams where he appeared above his own brothers. Dreams where, somehow, all of them ended up bowing down to him. Now think about that for a second. You already believe your father loves your brother more. You already see him being treated as special. Then he shows up saying that, one day, you are still going to bow down to him. It is not hard to imagine the atmosphere in that house. From that point on, anything could become a trigger, a comment, a look, a sentence said the wrong way. And little by little, they stopped seeing a brother. They started seeing a problem, but a problem inside a family is complicated because no one says what they are feeling right away. It builds up. It gets strange. The table is still the same. The house is still the same. But the atmosphere is not. Until one day, the father sent that son to go check on his brothers. They were far away, working, and he went, alone, probably thinking it was just another ordinary errand. But from a distance, his brothers saw him coming, and before he even got close, someone said it. Look, here comes the dreamer. And you can feel that it was not a joke. It was contempt. It was stored up anger. It was the kind of sentence that only comes out after someone has repeated it inside their own mind many times. That was where the conversation changed. Because until then, they could complain about him. They could avoid him. They could talk about him behind his back. But that day, someone suggested going much further. The first idea was horrifying. Get rid of him. For real. But one of the brothers tried to slow things down. Not because everything was fine, but because, apparently, that still felt like too much. So a second idea came up, less direct, easier to justify. Instead of doing it with their own hands, they could simply remove their brother from the picture, make him disappear. And for a moment, that seemed like the perfect solution. The brother would be gone. They would go back home. The father would never know the truth. And life, at least in their minds, would continue. A short time later, that boy who had left home to find his brothers was already being taken away by strangers. Far away, unable to return, unable to explain, unable to even understand how his own family had reached that point. And then comes what may be one of the cruelest parts, because they still had to go back home. They still had to look at their father. They still had to explain why the favorite son had left alive and had not come back. So they took his robe, that special robe, the one that had probably already become the symbol of everything they hated. They stained it with blood. They brought it to their father. And they did not even need to invent a long story. They just showed him the robe and asked if he recognized it. Do you understand the level of that? They let their own father build the tragedy in his mind. They let him imagine the worst possible scene. They let him believe that a wild animal had destroyed his son. And when he broke down, they stayed there, watching, knowing exactly that it was a lie. And for a long time, it looked like it had worked. The boy had disappeared. The father had believed it. The family kept living with that secret inside the house. But a secret like that never stays buried the way people imagine. Have you realized who I am talking about yet? Or not? Because usually, when people remember this story, they remember the man who became governor of Egypt, the guy who interpreted dreams, the emotional reunion with his family, but almost nobody remembers how it all began. This story was recorded in Genesis, chapters 37 through 50, and the part we just told is right at the beginning in chapter 37. The boy was Joseph, and those men were his own brothers. Strange, right? The most famous part of this story happens years later. But honestly, I think the hardest thing to understand was never what happened in Egypt. It was what happened inside that house. How does a group of brothers reach the point where they decide that another brother simply needs to disappear? Because a decision like that does not come out of nowhere. It grows in silence. Until, by the time everyone realizes it, it has already gone far beyond every limit. And maybe that is exactly why this story still feels so familiar. If we look only at the facts, it seems like something was already happening long before that walk toward his brothers. Because honestly, it is hard to believe all of this began because of two dreams. So the first question almost asks itself, was the boy really the problem? Or did he end up paying for something that already existed inside that family? Because the text makes a point of showing one thing. The father treated that son differently. The different robe, the different attention, the different trust. Maybe, to him, it was only a way of showing love. But is that how the other brothers saw it? Or did, every time they looked at that brother, they remember a preference they could never forget? Now comes another detail, the dreams. A lot of people read this part and quickly conclude he was being arrogant. But does the text actually say that? Not really. The text says he shared the dreams. That is all. It does not explain whether he said it with pride, or excitement, or without realizing the effect it would have. That silence is interesting, because it opened the door to very different interpretations over the centuries. Now, there is one thing the text does not leave open: the brothers' choice. They had time to think. They talked among themselves. They changed the plan. First, they thought about killing him. Then they decided to sell him. In other words, it was not a reaction that lasted a few seconds. It was a decision. And that changes the way we look at this story. Because there is a huge difference between losing control for a few moments and discussing, weighing options until choosing the one that seems best. And maybe this is exactly where the story becomes even more uncomfortable. Because after everything, they went back home. They looked at their father. They watched him suffer. And no one told the truth. Not that day, not the following week, not the following month. The lie became part of that family's routine. And maybe this is the final question of this chapter. What weighed more in that house during all those years? The absence of a son, or the presence of a secret everyone pretended did not exist? If there is one question that has followed this story for centuries, it is this: did the brothers hate that boy, or did they hate what he represented? Because over time, many people have looked at this story from different angles. One of the best-known interpretations is that the real problem was never Joseph. It was the father's favoritism. In this reading, the family was already divided long before the dreams appeared. Joseph became the face of a wound that had been growing for years. Other scholars call attention precisely to the dreams, not because they were the problem, but because they worked like the spark. what the brothers already felt, finally had a reason to explode. There are also those who look at this story from another side. In these interpretations, Joseph was not an arrogant boy. He was someone sharing what he believed he had received from God. The interesting thing is that the text does not try to settle that debate. It does not say how Joseph spoke. It does not describe his reaction. That silence allowed different readings across the centuries. Now, there is one thing almost everyone agrees on. Selling Joseph solved absolutely nothing. The brothers managed to remove him from their sight, but they did not manage to erase what they had done. The guilt remained inside the house. The father kept suffering, and the lie had to be fed every single day. Maybe that is exactly why this story still draws so much interest. It does not end when Joseph is sold. Actually, that is where it truly begins. There is something this story makes very clear. Sometimes we believe that if a person leaves our life, the problem will leave with them. It seems to make sense. If he were not here, if she had never shown up, if I did not have to live with this. But it almost never works that way. The brothers got exactly what they wanted. The boy disappeared. There were no more dreams, no more comparisons, no more favorite son walking around the house. And still, nothing went back to normal, because the problem was never only his presence. Now there was a suffering father, a lie that had to be repeated, a silence no one could break. It is strange how sometimes we place all the blame on one person, as if removing them from the picture would solve everything. But relationships do not work that way. When something is broken, pushing someone out of the story rarely fixes what remains. Most of the time, it only changes where the pain shows up. Maybe that is why so many people look back, years later, and realize they spent too much time trying to eliminate the symptom instead of understanding the cause. And maybe that is the most modern part of this story. The brothers spent years believing they had solved a problem. In reality, they had only delayed the moment when they would have to face it. Because some decisions seem to close a chapter, but they spend an entire lifetime writing the next ones. The worst part of this story was not even the sale. It was convincing the father, convincing everyone, and still, never being able to change what had actually happened. The truth kept existing, even when no one talked about it. And I think that still happens. We imagine that some decisions stay in the past, that all we have to do is never bring them up again. That time will fix it. But time does a curious thing. It may hide some stories, but it almost never erases their consequences. Maybe that is why this narrative still makes so much sense today. Because it is not only about a family that destroyed itself from the inside. It is about how easily we can start believing that a well-told lie is worth more than a difficult truth. But there is one problem. Lies usually need maintenance. The truth does not. It simply waits. And sooner or later, it finds a way to appear again. Maybe that is the most uncomfortable part of Joseph's story. His brothers spent years trying to hide one event, but they ended up spending far more time living with what they had done. And maybe that says more about human nature than it does about that family. Because in the end, we can hide a fact. We can hide a conversation. We can hide a choice. What we almost never manage to hide is the person we become after it. So, my friend, the next time it feels easier to hide a problem than to face it, maybe it is worth remembering this story. Because some truths take time, but they almost never give up. And, as I always say, history doesn't repeat. People do.